It's a sound that defined an era, a heartbeat of raw, thunderous energy that powered one of rock's most iconic bands. For millions, it was the soundtrack to their lives, the anthem of their rebellion, the pulse of their youth. But what happens when that heartbeat suddenly stops? What's left when the rhythm that drove a generation to its feet is silenced in an instant, leaving behind only a deafening, tragic void? This isn't just the story of a rock and roll tragedy. It's the story of a man whose life was the beat, a man who, at the very pinnacle of his career, vanished from the stage forever. A man whose name, once chanted by adoring crowds, has now been largely lost to the relentless march of time. This is the story of Darrell Sweet, the forgotten heart of Nazareth. The story of Darrell Sweet is inextricably linked to the story of Nazareth, and to understand them, you have to transport yourself back to a time when rock and roll was more than just music. It was a revolution. The late 1960s and early 1970s were a melting pot of cultural and musical upheaval. The polished pop of the early 60s had given way to something grittier, something more authentic. In the smoky pubs and working-class clubs of Britain, a new sound was being forged, a sound that was loud, unapologetic, and dripping with attitude. This was the era of classic rock, a time when bands like Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, and Black Sabbath reigned supreme. Their music was a potent cocktail of blues, folk, and sheer, unadulterated volume. It was a sound that resonated with a generation of young people who felt disenfranchised, who were looking for an identity outside the mainstream. And it was in this fertile ground that 4 young men from Dunfermline, Scotland, would plant the seeds of what would become one of the biggest rock bands in the world. Nazareth wasn't born in the glitz and glamour of London or Los Angeles. They were a product of their environment, a tough industrial town in the heart of Scotland. Their music reflected that upbringing. It was raw, honest, and had a blue-collar sensibility that set them apart from some of their more flamboyant contemporaries. They weren't trying to be rock gods. They were 4 mates who loved to play music, and that authenticity was a huge part of their appeal. Darrell Sweet was the anchor of that sound. Born on May 16, 1947 in Bournemouth, England, his family moved to Scotland when he was young. From an early age, he was drawn to the drums. It wasn't just about keeping time, it was about creating a feeling, a foundation upon which the rest of the band could build. He wasn't a flashy Keith Moon-style drummer, known for his wild antics and unpredictable fills. Darrell was a different kind of powerhouse. He was the engine room, the steady driving force that gave Nazareth their signature groove. In 1968, he co-founded the band with vocalist Dan McCafferty, guitarist Manny Charlton, and bassist Pete Agnew. In their early days, they were known as the Shadettes, cutting their teeth in the local pub and club circuit, honing their craft, and building a loyal following. They were a covers band, playing the hits of the day. But even then, there was a spark, a chemistry between the 4 of them that hinted at something greater. It was in 1970 that they made the fateful decision to change their name to Nazareth, inspired by the first line of the band's classic song, The Weight. It was a name that had a certain mystique, a biblical resonance that contrasted with their hard-rocking sound. With a new name came a new sense of purpose. They were no longer content to just be a local act. They had their sights set on something bigger. They were ready to take on the world. The early 1970s were a whirlwind for Nazareth. They packed their bags, moved to London, and threw themselves into the burgeoning rock scene. It was a gamble, leaving the security of their lives in Scotland for the uncertainty of the big city. But it was a gamble that would pay off in spectacular fashion. Their self-titled debut album, released in 1971, was a solid, if not groundbreaking, effort that laid the groundwork for what was to come. It was with their third album, Razamanas, released in 1973, that they truly found their voice. Produced by Deep Purple's Roger Glover, the album was a tour de force of hard rock, featuring a string of hit singles like Broken Down Angel and Bad Bad Boy. It was the album that put them on the map, not just in the UK, but across Europe. Suddenly, Nazareth were stars. They were on the cover of magazines, their songs were all over the radio, and their live shows were legendary. They toured relentlessly, building a reputation as one of the hardest working bands in the business. And at the heart of it all was Darrell Sweet, his powerful drumming driving the band forward night after night. His style was deceptively simple. He wasn't about flashy solos or intricate polyrhythms. Darrell was all about the groove, the pocket. He had an innate ability to lock in with bassist Pete Agnew, creating a rhythm section that was both incredibly tight and immensely powerful. It was a foundation that allowed guitarist Manny Charlton to unleash his searing riffs and vocalist Dan McCafferty to deliver his trademark raspy, soulful vocals. As one critic of the time noted, to see Nazareth live is to witness a lesson in rock and roll efficiency. There are no wasted notes, no self-indulgent solos. Every member of the band is there for one reason, and one reason only, to rock. And driving that rock and roll machine is Darrell Sweet, a drummer whose power is matched only by his precision. The mid-70s saw Nazareth reach the zenith of their fame. Their 1975 album, Hair of the Dog, was a massive international success. The title track, with its iconic talk box guitar riff, became a staple of rock radio, but it was their cover of the Everly Brothers ballad Love Hurts that turned them into global superstars. The song was a massive hit, reaching the top 10 in the United States and number 1 in several other countries. It was a surprising departure from their hard rock sound, but it showcased their versatility and musicality. Love Hurts was a double-edged sword for the band. While it brought them a level of success they had never imagined, it also created a certain image of them as a ballad band, which was at odds with their hard-rocking roots. But it was a testament to their songwriting and arranging skills that they could take a classic song and make it completely their own. And once again, Darrell's drumming was key. He didn't just play a simple beat. He created a mood, an atmosphere of heartbreak and longing that perfectly complemented McCafferty's raw, emotional, vocal performance. Throughout this period of intense fame and touring, Darrell remained the quiet, steady presence in the band. While other rock stars were trashing hotel rooms and living a life of excess, Darrell was more reserved. He was a family man, and the long stretches away from home took their toll. In interviews, he often spoke of the difficulty of balancing his life as a rock star with his role as a husband and father. "It's the best job in the world," he once said, "but it's also the hardest. You're living out of a suitcase. You're thousands of miles from the people you love. You have to really love the music to make it all worthwhile." And he did love the music. It was his passion, his lifeblood. It was the reason he was willing to make the sacrifices that he did. Every band has its stories, its moments of drama and near disaster that become the stuff of legend. For Nazareth, one of the most significant and rarely discussed incidents occurred during the recording of their 1974 album, Rampant. It was a moment that not only tested the band's resilience, but also revealed the deep, often unspoken bond between its members. They were in Montreux, Switzerland, recording at the famous Mountain Studios, a location that had become a haven for rock royalty. The pressure was on. Razamanas had been a huge success, and they were expected to deliver an even bigger follow-up. The sessions were intense, fueled by long hours, creative tension, and the ever-present expectations of the record label. One evening, after a particularly grueling day in the studio, Darrell and the band's ever-present roadie, a man who was more like a fifth member, decided to unwind. They were letting off steam, as rock bands do, when a friendly wrestling match took a disastrous turn. In a freak accident, Darrell fell awkwardly, landing with a sickening crack. The diagnosis was grim: a broken arm. For a drummer, a broken arm is more than just an injury. It's a potential career ender. The band was in shock. They were in the middle of recording an album with a world tour looming on the horizon. The thought of canceling everything was a devastating blow, both financially and creatively. The easy solution would have been to hire a session drummer, a professional who could come in and finish the album. It was what the record company wanted, what any pragmatic manager would advise. But Nazareth wasn't just a collection of musicians. They were a brotherhood. They had come up together, struggled together, and succeeded together. The idea of replacing Darrell, even temporarily, was unthinkable. It went against everything they stood for. In a moment that speaks volumes about their loyalty, the band made a decision that defied all industry logic. They would wait. Pete Agnew, the band's bassist and one of Darrell's closest friends, later recalled the conversation. There was no debate. We just looked at each other and knew. We told the management, we're not getting another drummer. We'll wait for Darrell. It was as simple as that. You don't leave a man behind. And so they waited. The recording schedule was thrown into chaos. The expensive studio time ticked by, but they held firm. They used the time to write, to rehearse the parts they could, and to support their friend. For Darrell, it was a period of intense frustration and anxiety. He was a man whose identity was tied to his ability to play, and suddenly that had been taken away from him. It was a dark time, he admitted in a later interview. You start to wonder if you'll ever play again, if the feeling will ever come back. But the guys, they were incredible. They never once made me feel like I was letting them down. Their support was everything. As his arm began to heal, Darrell started the slow, painful process of rehabilitation. He would sit at his kit for hours, tapping out simple rhythms, willing his muscles to remember, to respond. It was a testament to his determination and his love for his craft. And when he was finally able to play again, the band rallied around him, completing the album with a renewed sense of purpose and unity. Rampant was released to critical acclaim and commercial success. But for the members of Nazareth, its success was secondary to the victory it represented. It was a symbol of their solidarity, a testament to a friendship that was stronger than any broken bone or record company pressure. It's a story that's often overlooked in the grand narrative of their career, but it's a story that reveals the true character of the band and the quiet, unassuming drummer who was its heart. It showed that for Nazareth, the beat wasn't just about the music. It was about the man who created it. As the 1970s gave way to the 1980s, the musical landscape began to shift. The raw, blues-based rock of the early 70s was being challenged by new sounds, punk, new wave, and the emerging dominance of synth pop. For many of the classic rock bands, it was a period of adjustment, a struggle to remain relevant in a rapidly changing world. Nazareth, however, weathered the storm better than most. They continued to release a string of solid albums and tour relentlessly, their loyal fan base ensuring that their concerts were always packed. But the rock and roll lifestyle, with its constant travel and late nights, began to take its toll. While the band never descended into the kind of public feuds and acrimonious splits that plagued many of their contemporaries, there were inevitable tensions and pressures. One of the most significant points of contention within the band was their musical direction. Manny Charlton, the band's guitarist and primary songwriter, was keen to explore a more commercial AOR, album-oriented rock sound, believing it was the key to maintaining their success in the American market. This shift was evident on albums like The Fool's Circle and 2XS. Darrell, along with Dan and Pete, was more hesitant. While not opposed to experimenting, he was fiercely protective of the band's hard rock roots. He was a purist at heart, and he worried that in chasing commercial success, they might lose the very essence of what made them Nazareth. This creative friction wasn't a source of open conflict, but it simmered beneath the surface, a debate that played out in the studio and in their songwriting. It's a classic rock and roll dilemma. Stay true to your roots or adapt to the changing tastes of the market? There was no easy answer, and the debate within Nazareth reflected a broader conversation that was happening across the rock world. In retrospect, neither side was necessarily wrong. Charlton's commercial instincts were sharp, and his songwriting produced some of the band's most polished and accessible work. But Darrell's desire to stick to their guns was equally valid, a reflection of his commitment to the raw, honest music that had been their foundation from the very beginning. This period also saw Darrell step out from behind the drum kit and take on a more active role in the band's creative process. He co-wrote several songs, including the title track of their 1989 album, Snakes and Ladders. It was a powerful, driving rock anthem that showed he had a talent for songwriting that went beyond just creating a beat. He also dabbled in production, a sign of his growing confidence and his deep understanding of music. Perhaps the most significant and ultimately tragic controversy of Darrell's life was not a public scandal, but a private struggle. Like many musicians of his generation, he was a heavy smoker. It was a part of the culture, the rock and roll image, but it was a habit that would have devastating consequences. His health, particularly his cardiovascular health, was a growing concern, though it was something that was rarely discussed publicly. In the world of 80s, rock admitting to any kind of physical vulnerability was seen as a sign of weakness. The image was everything, the hard-living, indestructible rock star. But behind the scenes, friends and family were worried. The years of touring, the smoking, the sheer physical exertion of playing the drums night after night for decades, it all added up. There was no dramatic intervention, no public breakdown. Darrell was a private man, and he dealt with his health issues in his own way. But the signs were there for those who were close to him. He was often tired, more so than the usual tour fatigue. There were moments when his legendary stamina seemed to wane, but he was a professional, and he always delivered on stage. The beat for the audience never faltered. Looking back, this private struggle is perhaps the most poignant aspect of his later years. It highlights the immense pressure on musicians to maintain an illusion of invincibility, to hide their human frailties behind a wall of sound and stage lights. The historical debate here is not about a specific event, but about a culture, a rock and roll culture that often celebrated self-destruction and ignored the very real human cost of a life lived in the fast lane. Darrell Sweet was not a casualty of drugs or alcohol, the more common rock and roll cliches. He was a casualty of the lifestyle itself, of the relentless demands of a career that he loved, but that ultimately, tragically, cost him his life. The final chapter of Darrell Sweet's story is one of shocking, heartbreaking suddenness. It's a story that underscores the fragility of life and the cruel indifference of fate. On April 30th, 1999, Nazareth was on tour in the United States, set to play a show at the Floyd's Music Store in New Albany, Indiana. For the band, it was just another day on the road, another gig in a seemingly endless succession of gigs that had defined their lives for over 3 decades. The band's tour bus pulled up to the venue, There was the usual pre-show buzz, the routine of sound checks and preparation. But as the other members of the band began to disembark, they realized that Darrell was still on the bus. He was complaining of feeling unwell. It was a complaint that would soon turn to alarm. Pete Agnew, his friend of over 30 years, was with him. In interviews, Agnew has recounted the harrowing final moments of Darrell's life with a raw, palpable grief. Darrell's condition deteriorated rapidly. He was in the grip of a massive heart attack. The man who had been the unwavering, powerful heartbeat of Nazareth for 3 decades was now fighting for his own. Paramedics were called, and a frantic effort was made to save him. But it was too late. Darrell Sweet was pronounced dead on the tour bus just hours before he was due to take the stage. He was only 51 years old. The news was a devastating shock, not just to his bandmates, but to the entire rock community. How could this happen? Darrell was the quiet one, the steady one. He was the anchor. His death was not the result of a spectacular headline-grabbing act of rock and roll excess. It was a quiet, sudden, and utterly tragic end to a life dedicated to music. The immediate aftermath was a blur of grief and disbelief. The tour was, of course, canceled. The band, shattered by the loss of their friend and brother, retreated from the public eye to mourn. For Dan McCafferty, Manny Charlton, and Pete Agnew, it was more than just the loss of a bandmate. It was the loss of a part of themselves. They had spent more of their lives with Darrell than they had with almost anyone else. They had shared stages, dressing rooms, and tour buses. They had celebrated triumphs and weathered storms together. And now he was gone. The historical significance of Darrell's death is profound and multi-layered. On a personal level, it was a tragedy that ended a life far too soon and left a void in the lives of his family and friends. For Nazareth, it was a blow from which they would never fully recover. While they would eventually continue with a new drummer, Pete Agnew's son, Lee, the chemistry, the magic of the original lineup was gone forever. As Pete Agnew himself has said, Nazareth died with Darrell. His death also came at a time when the music world was changing. In 1999, the rock landscape was dominated by nu metal and alternative rock. The classic rock bands of the 70s were seen as relics of a bygone era. There was no grand televised tribute, no global outpouring of grief. His passing was noted in the music press, but it didn't capture the headlines in the same way that the death of a more contemporary star might have. And so, Darrell Sweet's story has become a cautionary tale about the transient nature of fame. It's a reminder that even for those who reach the very pinnacle of success, memory can be a fickle and fleeting thing. The beat that was once so powerful, so vital, has faded into the background, drowned out by the noise of new generations and new sounds. But for those who remember, for those who were there, the silence left by his passing is still deafening. So, where does that leave us? What is the ultimate takeaway from the life and death of Darrell Sweet? Is it simply a sad story of a rock star who died too young and has been largely forgotten? Or is there something more, a deeper lesson to be learned from his journey? At its core, the story of Darrell Sweet is a profoundly human one. It's a story about passion, loyalty, and the quiet dignity of a man who dedicated his life to his craft. He wasn't a rock and roll caricature. He was a husband, a father, and a friend. He was a musician of immense talent and unwavering professionalism. He was the steady, reliable heartbeat of a band that brought joy to millions. His story reminds us of the true meaning of brotherhood. In an industry known for its cutthroat competition and fragile egos, Nazareth was a band of brothers. Their decision to wait for Darrell to recover from his broken arm, to put their friendship before their career, is a powerful testament to the bond they shared. It's a moment of quiet heroism that stands in stark contrast to the often sordid tales of rock and roll excess. It also serves as a poignant reminder of the sacrifices that are often hidden behind the glamour of the stage. The endless miles on the road, the time away from loved ones, the physical and emotional toll of a life lived in the spotlight. These are the unseen costs of our entertainment. Darrell Sweet gave everything he had to the music, and in the end, it was a lifestyle that contributed to his untimely death. And what of his legacy? While his name may not be as widely known as some of his contemporaries, his music endures. Go to any classic rock radio station, any bar with a decent jukebox, and you will eventually hear the thunderous beat of a Nazareth song. You'll hear the driving rhythm of Hair of the Dog, the soulful pulse of Love Hurts, the raw energy of Razamanas. That is Darrell Sweet's legacy. It's in the music. It's in the beat that continues to move people, to make them tap their feet and nod their heads, even if they don't know the name of the man who created it. Perhaps the greatest tragedy is not that Darrell Sweet has been forgotten, but that we, as a culture, are so quick to forget. We consume music, art, and artists with a voracious appetite, always looking for the next new thing, often discarding the old with little thought or reverence. The story of Darrell Sweet challenges us to look deeper, to appreciate the foundations upon which our culture is built, to remember the quiet, steady contributors who may not have grabbed the headlines, but whose contributions were no less vital. In the end, Darrell Sweet's life was not a cautionary tale of excess, but a quiet epic of dedication. He was the man who kept the beat, not just for one of Scotland's greatest rock exports, but for a generation of fans who found a piece of their own story in the raw, honest, and powerful music of Nazareth. His heart may have given out on that lonely tour bus in Indiana, but the beat he gave the world, that powerful, unforgettable beat, plays on. And it's up to us to listen. And that wraps up today's video. If this video resonated with you, please give it a like, leave a comment with your feedback, and subscribe to stay updated on upcoming videos. Appreciate you watching.